As I said some time ago now, I am planning on doing a video on the Baedeker Blitz on Norwich that occurred in April 1942, and this is still very much the case. But these were not to be the first bombs dropped on Norwich. No, they've been falling for nearly 2 years at that point. So it only seems right that before we cover this, we start with the first raid launched in the summer of 1940 that brought a demonstration of total war to the people of Norwich. As is always the case, our story does not begin on the day itself, but rather long before in the mid-1930s, as those optimistic blue skies at the end of the First World War slowly but surely grew darker as day by day and action by action the world slid ever closer to oblivion again. These measurements in no way imply a risk of war in the near future, and they are wholly precautionary. These were the words of comfort offered by Whitehall in 1935, when they started to put forward the idea that local authorities should start making some kind of plan in case Britain was bombed from the air. This was not a totally preposterous idea. After all, Zeppelins and early bomber planes had made their way across the Channel during the Great War, and across the country had claimed 556 lives. One of these early Zeppelin raids was actually on Norfolk, and I have made a presentation of it in the past. Please follow the link on screen if you wish to see it. But when it came to these air raid precautions being suggested in the 1930s, had the official message been a bit more strongly worded, maybe more councils would have been better prepared when the bombs finally fell. Norwich, though, was not to be one of them. The city council were quick to realise they were effectively isolated out near the east coast, far enough away from the larger RAF bases near London that if the worst was to come, they would virtually be on their own for a while. Appointing an Air Raid Precautions Committee in March 1936, who would spend the next 2 years overseeing and planning out what the city's actions would be if an air raid was to come. All the time they planned, the newsreels showed that when the next war was to come, whole-scale bombings of cities would be commonplace. From the Japanese in China, to the Italians in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. All over the world, this scene was playing out time and time again. In 1938, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenlands, demanding that Czechoslovakia surrender them to him, sparking the Munich crisis. The world seemed to teeter on the edge, as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain travelled to Germany to meet with the Führer. When the news of this crisis took hold in Norwich, it brought a hurried digging of slit trenches and dugouts in city parks and public spaces, with many in the council seeming to think the planes would be overhead any moment. Although this seems to have quickly devolved into debates over which was better for protection, slit trenches or deeper shelters. There were some upsides to this scare, though. It greatly encouraged people to start digging their own shelters in their gardens, and showed how easily gas masks could be distributed to the population when needed. Fortunately, though, none of this would be needed, and in time Chamberlain returned, stating there would be peace for our time, having signed the Munich Agreement. It would prove not to be a lasting peace, although the people of 1938 were not to know this, and many saw this step back as a de-escalation of tensions, and hopefully something that would avoid all-out war. The citizens who made up the ARP committee, though, were keen not to take their eye off the ball, and in this short period of peace were able to install 11 air raid sirens around the city and recruit more ARP wardens. Despite their head start, though, there was still a momentous task ahead of them, and by the time war was declared in September 1939, Norwich had a population of around 126,000, with public shelter space for just 17,000, although this would of course grow as the war raged on. As the months of 1939 ticked into 1940, Norwich, although well aware the war was of course going on, had not been physically affected by it yet, and much was being done in the city as well as across the country to keep civilians' minds off the constant worry. The city cinemas played the most popular films of the day, from Come On George starring George Formby, to Goodbye Mr. Chips with Robert Donat. Along with this, the nightclubs and dance halls all over the country were doing a roaring trade, with so many wanting to take any opportunity they can to forget about the world's problems for a few hours. And when it came to war worries, Norfolk and Norwich certainly were not separate from the rest of the country. The fall of France in May and June of 1940 had seen the virtual destruction of the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, the 7th Battalion of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. Norfolk Yeomanry Anti-Tank Regiment had also suffered horribly trying to hold back the German advance. And now with the British Isles seemingly facing an impossible task, with the only fully equipped division in the country being a Canadian one, and most others lacking men and equipment desperately. It seemed only a matter of time before the inevitable happened, and the fate that had befallen so many countries in Europe came to them. Norwich came close to facing its first trial by fire on the 4th of July 1940, when a Luftwaffe Dornier 17 bomber was picked up on radar nearing the city. 3 Spitfires from No. 66 Squadron, stationed at RAF Coltishall, were scrambled, and they went out looking for their target. Climbing to a height of 15,000 feet over the village of Stalham, they finally found their prey and engaged. One was badly damaged by German machine gun fire and forced to disengage, but the other 2 were successful in shooting the plane down over the North Sea. Although, I'll be honest, another source I have read seems to indicate this may have happened on the 10th of July, but I'm not sure if they were just 2 incredibly similar incidents. To many, it may have seemed that Norwich could rest safely, assured by the protection of the radar and the RAF. But this daydream would come to a sudden and bloody end at around 5 p.m. on Tuesday the 9th of July. It was the end of a warm summer's day for the people of Norwich, and it would prove to be a day the city would never forget. Despite the years of preparation and the months of recent training, the day when it was first truly needed, the air raid sirens didn't sound. So unaware, the factories that made up a large part of the southeast of the city, work carried on as normal. Many in the city had not even noticed the 2 black dots overhead were not passing friendlies, but a Dornier 17 escorted by a Junkers 88. The main target for their attack was probably Bolton and Pools. It was found on Riverside and Carrow Hill, who at the time was contracted by the RAF, making wooden fuselages for Oxford training aircraft. But given the inaccuracy of all sides when it came to bombing in the Second World War, many of those dropped always fell into surrounding areas. The aerial invaders did not go totally unnoticed by everyone on the ground, though, and among those who did notice them was David Stratton, who at the time was hanging around with some friends on Thorpe Hamlet Escarpment, not far from the old Norwich City Football Club home ground known as the Nest. David assumed he was looking at a passing British bomber until the rain of death started to come down. At first, it still didn't register what it was that was falling from the aeroplane. Then someone called out that they were bombs, and with that, everyone scattered back towards their homes. I ran down a little passageway that led off Florence opening, and as I went, I can remember feeling the reverberations of the bombs exploding. In total, 11 bombs were dropped in a staggered line, among them several incendiaries, across an area of the city as the raiders flew over, hitting targets from Salhouse Road to the engine sheds in Thorpe Station, now Norwich Station, and Carrow Hill. Salhouse Road, just outside the city limits, would be where the first victim was claimed, a 60-year-old housewife named Kate Lovett, who lived in the Grange Cottage in Sprowston. One of the following incendiaries also destroyed a warehouse on Salhouse Road. A little further along, 2 men, Harold Dye and Arthur Shevers, were killed, and others were injured. Among them, Robert Green, a dispatch foreman who'd been able to throw himself to safety at the last moment, resulting in an injury to one of his toes that was later amputated. This would take place while the group of men were loading trucks at Barnard's Ironworks. High explosive bombs hit Bolton and Pools directly, bringing down the roof of the engineering shop, claiming 10 lives. Among them, the raid's youngest victim, Frederick Wright, aged 16, who was employed as a labourer. Killed alongside him was Charles Henry Bacon, 35, a steel driller. 70 others were also injured in the carnage there. But it would be a bomb that overshot its target and landed on Carrow Hill that would lead to the raid's lasting legacy and shocked the city the most. Given the time of day the bombing took place and the lack of any air raid alarm, many were in the process of leaving work as death flew overhead and had no idea of the danger they were in. Among them was many women, including a group of 5, walking home from Coleman's mustard factory, pushing their bikes up the steep hill along with many, many others. The women who worked in Coleman's mustard factory and a nearby company called Rickett were affectionately known as Carrow Girls. These Carrow Girls, along with many others on the hill, had virtually no time to react to the falling bombs before they fell victim to the same fate as many civilians in Europe had already seen. The exact size of the bomb that hit is unknown, but is not believed to have been above 50 kilograms. When it hit, it instantly turned a packed road of tired workers heading home into total chaos of running feet, choking smoke, flying shrapnel and brick. And when the dust finally settled, Dozens lay wounded, others searched for friends and colleagues, as the road ran with blood. Of the 5 Carrow girls, 2 were killed instantly. Maud Pamela Ballum, 40, who had worked at Coleman's for 26 years. Bessie Gladys Upton, 36, who was a forewoman in the mustard packing department and had worked for the company for the last 23 years. The 3 others were badly injured and taken to the Norfolk and Norwich hospital, but sadly none of them were to leave. Bethel Rose Playford, who was 19, and Gladys Rose Sampson, 18, both worked as mustard tin machinists and had both been working at Coleman since they were 13 years old. They died in the following hours while receiving medical care. And Maud Ethel Burrell, 37, would cling to life in hospital before succumbing to her injuries on the 12th of July. Obituaries for all 5 women were printed in the next issue of the Carrow Works magazine. Although the tragedy on Carrow Hill would be the most well-known site of the raid, the falling bombs brought death everywhere they fell. At Thorpe Railway Station they hit a workshop, cutting short the lives of Bertie Holt, 55, a boilermaker foreman, Ernest Robert Sillen, 58, a railway engine driver, Richard Albert Parker, 37, a railway boilermaker, George Arthur Payne, 37, William Benjamin Lord, 50, both also railway boilermakers, Charles George Freeman, 44, an assistant railway boilermaker, and Stanley Douglas Laffin, 23, a railway labourer. It was a short attack, only lasting about 6 seconds from the first bomb hitting to the last, but in that time would kill 26 people. And to put that into some context, all of those killed in Norwich in bombings in 1940 totaled to 60, with 190 additionally wounded. I've been unable to place exactly where everyone was killed in the raid from the sources I have, but it seems it would be a disservice not to mention them as I have others. Most of them, I believe, were probably killed at Bolton and Pools, given their job titles, but I was unable to get the numbers to line up right, and I feel it would be wrong just to assume where they may or may not have been, so they are included here. Frederick Evelyn, 32, no job stated. Albert Ernest Sayer, 53, no job stated. Robert Daniels, 30, a steel riveter. Herbert Percy Kiddle, 44, a steel erector. John Henry Macmillan, 60, a labourer. Carlos Anthony Suet, 46, a machinist mate. Arthur George Smith, 23, a steel driller. Arthur Samuel Strike, 23, a steel riveter. And George Stroger, 27, a steel plater. Along with the human cost, the bombing also destroyed factories, railway sheds and lines, as well as damaging many roads and other buildings. And, on a level of certain grim irony, it also destroyed an air raid siren, as well as a 40-foot section of the city's old wall around Wilderness Tower, being knocked down by a shock wave from the blasts. The fact that the air raid sirens had never sounded caused outrage across the city, leading to the Norwich Trade Council calling an urgent meeting of all the unions in the city, leading them to releasing a statement saying that if the warning systems were not dramatically improved, output across the city would suffer, as long as their members' lives were in danger, leading to the clerk of the city releasing a following statement. I'm aware there is considerable indignation in the city because the air raid sirens are not sounded. I have spoken personally to the regional commissioner, Sir William Speds, on the telephone and asked him to make urgent representations. A memorial to the 5 Carrow girls killed on Carrow Hill was unveiled in 2001, near the site where they were killed, while a memorial to all of those who lost their lives in the bombings of Norwich can be found in St Peter Mancroft Church. I've only been able to find good information on one of the graves of the victims, and that being Charles Henry Bacon, the steel driller killed at Bolton and Pools. He was laid to rest in Earlham Cemetery, and his gravestone reads, "In loving memory of Charles, the beloved husband of Violet Bacon, who was killed on the 9th of July, 1940, aged 35. Peace, perfect peace. Reunited with Violet, died 20th of December 2003, aged 97. The city would be allowed a short reprieve before the raiders returned 10 days later, this time for a morning attack around Magdalen Street. And this would very much set the tone for the next few years in the city, with small raids every week or so, and all of this before a single bomb had ever been dropped on London. But these are stories for another time. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. And I would also like to take this time to thank each and every one of you who has helped this channel cross the 10,000 subscriber milestone. This was the 9th of July 1940, the first bombing of Norwich, and this was a little bit of history.